Incident 1. The bag that arrived too soon in airline work. Timing is certainty, until one time stop refuses to match the flight. It was not dramatic, not dangerous, and that is why it stayed with me. Commercial flying is designed to make the sky feel owned. Routes exist because someone proved they work. Altitudes are assigned because separation is calculated, and modern cockpits are built around situational awareness. Between navigation computers, radar, traffic displays, and constant radio work, you are rarely guessing where you are or what is near you. Most anomalies have a category and a checklist. A sensor drifts, a valve sticks, a person enters data late, and the chain of logs usually leaves a visible trail for someone to follow. This leg was routine. Clear weather, light traffic, nominal systems, and an arrival a few minutes early. We were taxiing in when the cabin called the cockpit to say a passenger was worried about his checked bag. That happens on nearly every flight, so we gave the standard response and kept working our shutdown flow. After the door opened and passengers started filing out, the lead attendant came forward again, quieter than before, and said the man insisted his suitcase was already waiting at baggage claim. As if he had seen it there himself. In the jet bridge, the passenger held out his phone. The photo showed his bag sitting alone near the carousel, a distinctive color with a scuffed corner and a ribbon tied to the handle. The timestamp said it had been taken minutes earlier. I assumed it was an old photo used to make a point, but then he opened the baggage notification and the tag trace. His bag had been scanned into the destination system before we landed. Airline baggage handling is chaotic, but it is not magical. A bag does not appear as arrived until it is physically offloaded and scanned, and those scans are logged automatically. Back in the cockpit, my first officer pulled the trace, and we checked what we could. The departure scan was correct. The load sheet accounted for the bag. Ramp records at the origin matched the tag. The cargo door seal check was normal. Yet the arrival scan sat there, time-stamped several minutes before touchdown, cleanly early with no error flags and no other bags affected. Ground operations called it a sync issue, old systems releasing information out of order. The passenger collected his suitcase intact and left. Later, with the aircraft parked for the night, I reopened the timeline and wrote one line in a private notebook. 2 weeks later, I added a second. I told myself the easiest answer was that a clock somewhere was wrong, or a database was catching up. Still, the cleanliness bothered me. It was one object, one time, no spillover. On the next trip, I found myself watching gate times and chocks, the numbers that normally fade into routine, waiting to see whether the air would stay obedient quietly. Asterisk. The minutes that went missing time is the one variable in flight planning that never argues back until it does. We did not feel faster. We did not fly differently. But the numbers quietly disagreed. It was a medium-length domestic leg, the kind that settles into cruise long enough for you to relax without ever forgetting the clock. These flights live and die on minutes, not drama. Fuel planning, descent windows, crew duty limits, all of it assumes time behaves the same everywhere. The weather was clean from departure to destination, not the polite kind of clear, but the absolute kind that leaves nothing to brief. We leveled off early, engines steady, fuel flow exactly where it should be, ground speed right on the expected line. There was no reason to think about anything except the routine rhythm of radios and checklists, and that is why the first call from air traffic control felt slightly out of place. They asked us to confirm our position. I read it back. There was a pause. Then they asked again. Then they asked for our ground speed, and finally told us to continue as cleared. Nothing about that exchange was alarming, but it did not fit the usual pattern. A few minutes later, we were handed off to the next sector earlier than expected. The first officer noticed it at the same time I did, tapping the navigation display as if the map itself might explain. We cross-checked winds, Then the flight plan timing. According to the clock, we were ahead. According to the engines and the speed, we were not. According to distance, we should not have been. The rest of the flight behaved perfectly. The approach was ordinary, the landing smooth, and we would have forgotten the whole thing if I had not pulled the post-flight data out of habit. The log showed a transition between two waypoints that happened faster than the distance between them should have allowed. The timestamps were clean, sequential, and confident, as if nothing unusual had occurred. We recalculated it by hand and reached the same quiet conclusion. There were explanations you could try to stack on top of it, but none of them stayed upright for long. Tailwind did not fit. Altitude changes did not exist. Instrument disagreement would have shown up somewhere else. When something does not affect safety, aviation has a simple rule: write it down and move on. So we did. 3 months later, on a different route and a different aircraft, the same shape appeared again. This time, air traffic control asked us to slow and cruise because, according to them, we were closing on traffic ahead faster than expected. According to our displays, we were not closing on anything at all after that flight. I asked for the timing data through normal channels. When it came back, it did not match ours. Their system showed us passing through controlled airspace earlier than our own systems claimed. I stopped talking about it in crew rooms, not because anyone told me to, but because I recognized how quickly oddities become stories and how little aviation values stories. Still, I started paying attention. Some flights felt longer, some shorter, most normal. There was no pattern in altitude or route that I could defend, just stretches of sky that seemed to let you through without charging the usual toll in minutes. You do not feel anything when it happens. There is no vibration, no visual change, no sense of motion. If you are not watching the numbers, you would never know. That is what makes it unsettling, not as danger, but as possibility. After the 5th time, I began to wonder what would happen if we stayed inside one of those shortened stretches longer than we were supposed to. And that was when I realized I had started measuring parts of the sky the way you measure rooms you do not quite trust. Asterisk. The voice without an aircraft. Not everything strange arrives as an error message or a warning light. Sometimes it comes in perfectly correct language. And that is what makes it harder to notice. We were in cruise over open water, in the middle of a quiet stretch of international airspace, where the radios are busy but predictable, when a transmission came in that did not carry any urgency with it at all. The voice identified an aircraft by call sign and tail number, reported position, altitude, and heading, and asked for confirmation of nearby traffic, using phraseology that was clean and professional, enough to disappear into the background of routine. Air traffic control answered, issued a normal advisory, and cleared the aircraft to continue. I glanced at our traffic display and saw nothing that matched the call. That happens sometimes, and usually you forget about it before the frequency moves on. The voice sounded slightly flatter than most, less processed, but radio quality varies. And I did not give it more weight than that. A few minutes later, the same aircraft called again, thanked control, and reported clear of the area. We still never saw it, not on displays and not outside, and then the sector changed, and the day kept going. It was only later, during a layover, that the first officer mentioned the call sign had sounded unfamiliar. Out of curiosity, he had tried to look it up, and found that it was not missing from the database, but removed from it. The tail number belonged to an aircraft that had disappeared more than 50 years earlier, over open water, without a confirmed crash site, and without a final explanation that ever satisfied anyone. The identifier had been retired shortly after. When he showed me the record, the shape of the thing did not fit into any box. I was used to reaching for dot. We requested the cockpit audio and played the transmission back. It was there, clean and ordinary, with no distortion and no signs of being a recording. Air traffic control confirmed they had heard it as well, but they had no radar return and no transponder data to match it. Someone suggested it might have been an old clip bleeding through, but it had been interactive, responding to instructions in real time. The internal conversation ended without a decision, and we were advised to note it only as an unidentified transmission, a phrase that is wide enough to hold almost anything. The file went into an archive, and the schedule moved on. I told myself it was coincidence layered on coincidence, a reused identifier, and a radio oddity intersecting by chance. That explanation stayed upright until a few weeks later, in a crew room halfway across the world, when another pilot mentioned a strange call he had heard once, a voice that sounded older than it should have, attached to a call sign that did not belong to anything he could see. When he told me which one, the room seemed to get smaller without anyone moving. Neither of us followed that thread any further. From that point on, every time a voice appeared on the frequency without a body attached to it, I found myself listening harder than the job requires. And I began to wonder whether the sky was not just shortening distances, but also finding ways to let things pass through that no longer had any reason to be there. The lights that kept their distance night flights teach you how little there is to see, and how much you start noticing because of it. When something holds its place in empty sky, you cannot pretend it belongs there for long. This happened on a long night crossing over open water, the kind of flight where the outside world reduces itself to stars and the faint reflection of instruments on glass. These stretches are quiet in a way that sharpens attention. With fewer radio calls and nothing to watch, small changes stand out more than they should. The first officer was the one who noticed it, and he did not speak right away. He leaned forward, adjusted his seat, and looked again, following the habit every pilot learns early, to confirm with your own eyes before you involve someone else. Then he asked if I could see something off the left side. At first, I assumed it was a reflection, because it almost always is. Instrument lighting, a star lining up just wrong, the cockpit finding a way to copy itself onto the window. I shifted my head and changed angles. The light did not move. It was blue, not the pale blue of a strobe, and not the cold blue of a star, but a deep, saturated color that looked solid rather than bright. It sat slightly below our altitude, and a few miles off the wing, steady and unblinking. Then a second one appeared, then a third, not popping into existence, but fading in as if they had been there all along, and we had only just noticed. They were not flashing, and they left no contrails. They simply held position, matching our speed. I checked the traffic display. Nothing. I checked the weather radar. Clear. We adjusted speed slightly, not enough to matter operationally, just enough to see whether the spacing would change. It did not. The lights corrected with us, not sharply, not aggressively, just enough to remain where they were. That was when the cockpit went very quiet, not from fear, but from the absence of a reportable category. You do not call control to say there is something strange. You need altitude, bearing, distance, behavior. I asked if there was any traffic near us. There was not. I asked again with specifics. Still nothing. We watched them for several minutes. They did not approach, and they did not fall behind. Then one of them moved, not by accelerating away or climbing or descending, but by sliding sideways, arcing around our nose and settling into a new position on the other side of the aircraft, as if the geometry of the scene had been redrawn while the scale stayed the same. I had heard of things like this before, in the careful language of briefings and in the dry phrasing of safety reports that never draw conclusions, only describe what was seen. The behavior matched those entries more than I wanted it to. Control called to say another aircraft behind us had reported unusual blue lights in the same area. That changed the sense of size of it. We were not alone in it. One by one, the lights dimmed and disappeared, the last lingering longer before sliding backward into the dark. The rest of the flight was uneventful, and our report was written in the only way it could be written, precise and minimal. Later, another crew asked quietly if we had seen anything on the route. They had. From then on, every night over open water felt a little wider and a little less empty, and I started to wonder what it would mean if something like that ever decided not to keep its distance. Asterisk. The sky that turns solid. Some anomalies stay at the edge of attention and let you keep working. This one filled the windshield and refused to behave like distance at all. It was a night flight over ordinary. Well-managed airspace. Nothing remote, nothing exotic. With weather that had been clean across every briefing and update. The first half passed in the way most do, quietly enough that neither of us would have remembered it later. The first sign was the horizon, which looked at a glance like distant weather lit by city glow, a common illusion that usually resolves itself as you get closer. This did not resolve. The sky ahead was red, not streaked or layered or moving, but a deep, uniform color that filled the entire forward view from left to right and from below the nose to well above our altitude. It had not brightened into place. It was simply there, like a wall that had been waiting. I went to the weather radar immediately. Clear. I changed the tilt, increased the gain, switched modes, and got the same answer each time. The first officer leaned forward and kept his eyes on the glass longer than felt comfortable. And neither of us said anything, because there was nothing useful to say. The red did not approach the way clouds do, and did not break into shapes. It waited. Then the turbulence began, not as a buildup, but as an impact, sharp enough that the autopilot disconnected, and the aircraft lurched as if it had met resistance rather than air. The controls responded, but the feedback felt wrong, like moving through something uneven. Outside, the red seemed to thicken, and movement appeared inside it. First as a darker band, and then as a shape large enough that scale stopped making sense. Another followed, and then another, crossing the forward field of view at different depths. Not with the behavior of traffic, but with the slow, deliberate motion of things that do not need to hurry. One passed close enough that the sense of proximity became physical, and the aircraft shuddered again as if crossing a wake. Control called to ask if we were in turbulence, and I answered yes and requested an immediate deviation. The approval came without hesitation, and I committed to a full reversal rather than a gentle turn, because the space ahead no longer felt like space. As the turn completed, the red did not fade. It folded inward, the way a surface might if it were being drawn tight, and a darker wing formed around a lighter center. We crossed that boundary, and the sky snapped back to normal, black and empty and indifferent. And the turbulence stopped as if a switch had been thrown. We returned to our departure, airport under a weather-related reason that fit into the system. Maintenance found nothing. The data showed sharp turbulence and nothing else. In a quiet room later, the first officer asked what would have happened if we had kept going, and I had no answer that belonged to procedures. Since then, I have noticed how easy it is for a section of sky to look like an ordinary route, right up until the moment it does not. And I have wondered whether the only real warning is the one that arrives too late to use. Asterisk. What fell out of clear air? Not every strange thing announces itself with lights or color. Sometimes it arrives as weather, and only later refuses to stay ordinary. The last incident did not look important at first, which is probably why it has stayed with me longer than the rest. We were on descent into a busy terminal area, and the ride was rougher than forecast, but still within the kind of turbulence that shows up in briefings and gets forgotten by the gate. Then it intensified quickly, sharp jolts and sudden drops, the sort that makes you secure the cabin and accept that the schedule will absorb a few minutes of discomfort. The radar showed nothing that matched the feeling of it. No cells, no returns, no reason for the air to be acting like that. And then something struck the windshield hard enough that both of us flinched. Another impact followed, then several more, irregular and loud, as if we were passing through a dense shower of debris. The aircraft shook, and the noise moved along the fuselage in a way hail sometimes does. So that was the word we used, because it was the closest one available. We slowed and descended a little faster than planned, and just as abruptly as it had started, the impact stopped. The rest of the approach was smooth, and the landing was unremarkable, except for the inspection that followed. Maintenance found fragments along the leading edges and in seams where ice should not lodge. Small pieces smeared into paint and caught in gaps. At first, it looked like insulation or ground equipment residue, until someone picked one up and realized it was sticky. Another piece was intact enough to identify, and that was when the room went quiet in the way it does when no one wants to be the first to say what they are seeing. They were candy, flattened and cracked from impact, different colors scattered in places where only air is supposed to be. There was no cargo like that on board, and no weather that explained it. The report used careful language about unknown debris associated with turbulence, and the wings were cleaned and signed off. Nothing was kept, because nothing in the system had a reason to keep it. People laugh when they hear that one, even pilots, and I understand why. It sounds like a story that wants to be a joke, and jokes are easier to store than questions. I still fly, and I still trust the airplane and the people and the discipline that makes the whole thing work. What has changed is not my confidence, but my map. Over the years, I have come to accept that there are small pockets of airspace that do not behave the way the rest of it does. Places where time feels shorter, where objects arrive early, where voices appear without bodies, and where the sky briefly takes on a character it does not keep. None of this happens often, and that is why aviation continues as if it never happens at all. Most crews will never see any of it, and many who dowel decide it is not worth carrying. Asterisk. When I look out now, especially at night over water or during a quiet descent, I find myself watching not for threats, but for efficiencies that feel too clean. The sky does not seem hostile, only indifferent, like a system that allows us through without ever promising to make sense. If there is a rule hiding in all of this, it is not about fear, but about limits, and about how easily we mistake coverage for understanding, and how one day a perfectly normal flight can pass through a place that does not quite agree with being measured.